Well, I hate to tell you this. This is our last class for the church school year, and you'd think I could kind of end on a really great text, and so the text I'm going to wind up on is, should women wear hats in church? A burning issue, one that, and I see some hats, there we are, so there we go. So I imagine we'll have some good, strong opinions on this subject, but anyway, this is just the way it works out. We are going to be winding up at verse 16 of chapter 11, and that's as much progress as we will make this year. So it's an odd place to end for the summer, I grant. If I'd been better organized, I'm sure I could have done this in a more rational spot in the text, but that's just the way it's turning out. We will, as I've indicated, Lord willing, pick up in this very same series in the fall as if there had been no interruption whatsoever, and we'll pick up really with a great text in 1 Corinthians, which deals with the Lord's Supper. And so that's going to be our point of departure next fall, chapter 11, verse 17, and then of course we'll finish 1 Corinthians and continue our excursion through the letters of Paul. The next one will be 2 Corinthians. Paul just writes 2 Corinthians only months after 1 Corinthians, and so that'll be where we go from there, but that will all be in the fall. So just to remind you, we're right now just at the beginning of chapter 10, verse 1, and this is a little, maybe two-thirds of the way through Paul's discussion of the question of eating food that's been sacrificed to idols, which again seems like one of those museum piece issues. What do we care about food sacrificed to idols? Thank you so much. Very thoughtful. But I think as we look at the text, we realize there's some much broader principles involved than simply that narrow question, and so hopefully that's been of help to us as well. Because we had to just stop right in the middle of that, let me just take a minute to remind you of Paul's basic point. Beginning at the first part of chapter 8, he's acknowledging one particular point of view in the Corinthian church, namely that the food itself is fine. Even though it's gone through a pagan ritual, there's no taint in the food. It doesn't acquire new germs, or have little demons in it. It's okay. The food is fine. That's part of the robust New Testament view that the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. So, it's fine. But Paul says not everybody quite understands that. Especially people who have been for years steeped in paganism. They've worshipped in these temples. They've participated in these sacrificial rites. And for them, the association with idolatry is so strong that to eat that food would actually injure their conscience. And so Paul is saying if that's that's the case, you shouldn't eat the food, But he's also saying to those people who think there's no problem, you should also waive your right to eat the food in deference to your weaker brother or sister in Christ. It's a loving thing to do. You know better, but you're prepared to, as it were, defer and even stoop, in a sense, to their level of need. Now, this is not a condescending thing. It's simply recognizing that we all have points in our life of faith where we have impairments. We have besetting sins. We have peculiar areas that we are tempted where others might not be. And we always need to be thinking in that way. What's good for the larger community here, and not simply what's good for me. And so even though Paul will give permission for them to eat this food, he wants to warn them not to do it in a cavalier way, an arrogant way, a way that is sort of showing a sort of superiority that would be injurious, or a way that would induce people to themselves act against conscience. Paul then uses himself as an example of this notion of giving up your rights. He's asking the Corinthians, in a sense, to give up their rights, And he says, look what I've done. Paul uses himself to illustrate the point. He talks about a variety of things, but mainly he talks about how he could insist on being compensated for his labors as an apostle. He could ask for revenue. He could ask for donations. But he makes quite a point out of the fact that he's not doing that. His boast, he says, is that he does his labor in the gospel free of charge. And that becomes, the basis for, in a sense, his great independence as an apostle. He's not depending on those who would be supporting him. But he says, I could take a believing wife with me in traveling. I could, a variety of things he mentions there, chief of which would be that he's supported in his ministry. But he says, I'm always thinking about the greater principle of the gospel. What does the gospel call me to in a higher sense? It's like running a race. And that focus on the goal, the reward, the finish line has to dictate the things I might have the right to do. I'm going to forego those things for the greater purpose, the greater principle that I'm serving here of the gospel. And that was really the thought that we left off on last week. So we're at I'm going to pick up at verse 24 of chapter 9. And then we'll work our way through and at least get some distance into chapter 11. So that's kind of reconstructing our thoughts from last week. Let's have a word of prayer and then we'll get going. Father, we're grateful that you give us this privilege and opportunity to continue our discussion of the matters that were so important to the Corinthians and which have given rise to important lessons for us as well. We ask your blessing on our discussion now of this text. Ask that your Spirit would be here among us to give us an understanding of it. We give you thanks for that in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, let's pick up then. We're on this is page 172, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning at verse 24. And Paul says, don't you know that in a race the runners all compete, but only one receives the prize. And there's a mindset, of course, of the athlete setting aside things that might ordinarily be perfectly fine to do, but for the sake of the race, those things are suspended. Paul says, do the same thing. Run in such a way that you may win the race. We're not in a race against each other, of course. It's not that kind of competition. But there is a kind of competitive attitude in the sense that we are focused on the goal. And we want to, as it were, strip down to the bare essentials so that we're not impeded in pressing toward that mark. And if eating food, sacrificed to idols or something of that nature is going to impede the progress in our Christian growth, then we need to just forestall it. Or if it's going to impede somebody else's progress, then we need to think in those terms. He says, athletes exercise self-control in all things. They do it to receive merely a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. And how much more is our goal justifying of a greater commitment than even a human athlete, as it were. So I do not run aimlessly, he says, nor do I box as though beating the air. There's a coordinated effort in my pressing toward this mark. And he says, I punish my body and enslave it, so that after proclaiming to others, I myself should not be disqualified. Some have looked at that text and probably drawn an illegitimate inference from it. Paul says, I punish my body, or the older versions put, I pummel my body, as if beating my body. I think you know that in the Middle Ages there were certain, in the monastic movement, that would actually do that literally. As a mode of sanctification, they would beat themselves with a whip, and all sorts of things that really are not warranted biblically, but they would look at this text. Well, Paul says he punished his body, so isn't that some justification for it? That's not Paul's idea. I think you probably intuitively sense that. What Paul means here, however, is that he's not going to let circumstances that become abusive to his body prevent him from this determination to serve Christ and to be a minister of the gospel. So for the sake of the gospel, his body has been punished. He has been shipwrecked in Malta. He has been stoned and left for dead. He has been publicly caned. He has been imprisoned in Philippi. All of those things happened to him, and in a sense they were punishing to his body. Not that Paul was going out seeking that, but it just was of the nature of the pursuit of serving Christ that it should happen. And Paul's not going to shy away from serving Christ to avoid these punishments of the body. And so he can say, in a sense, I punish my body for the sake of the gospel. That should be true of all of us. You see that there's a kind of willingness to sacrifice the comforts of life for the higher good. And Paul's saying, how about this little comfort of giving up some meat? Big deal compared to some of the greater sacrifices that others might be called on to make. He also says, I do this so that I should not be disqualified. This, of course, is interpreted two different ways. Arminian Christians would say that what Paul means is I do this so that I don't lose my salvation. Calvinists would say, I do this in a sense to provide evidence that I've always had my salvation. A little bit of different view. I don't want to, deal with that text or that idea separately, but the point here is that there is in genuine Christianity a perseverance. Calvin's, that was his fifth point in the 5 points of Calvin. P, perseverance. True Christians persevere. And if a person doesn't persevere, then there is a lack of reality in their faith in the first place. That would be Calvin's understanding. And Paul seems to be at least illustrating that and hoping the Corinthians see that if they themselves are in a sense negotiating their determination to obey Christ for the sake of petty comforts like food in the marketplace, that may in fact provide evidence of their own disqualification. And he says, let's talk about this. Let's look at some Old Testament examples of this. And so in chapter 10, he begins to refer back to some examples of people who were, as it were, disqualified. These examples then come from basically Exodus and Numbers. I don't want you to be unaware, he says, chapter 10 now, verse 1, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. Okay, so we have the people of Israel in the Old Testament. They are liberated from Egypt under the mighty hand of God and the leadership of Moses. They go through the Red Sea, as it were, baptized, in the Red Sea. They go out into the wilderness. They all eat the manna. They all drink the water. They all are sustained miraculously. They all seem to be people of genuine faith. They are all part of the visible community associated with Moses and with Yahweh, the God of Moses. And so at least by external measures, they all seem to be in, but they're not. Some of them are going to be disqualified. And Paul's point to the Corinthians is just that. You all are in the Corinthian church. You all seem to be participants in this visible community, but your behavior, to me, raises a warning flag that some of you may be disqualified. Because the arrogance with which you're treating your brothers and sisters in Christ is not consistent with the gospel. It's not the effect of the work of the gospel in you. And so Paul wants to raise this warning to them. He says concerning the Israelites in the Old Testament, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness. Vast numbers of them came, but they had no faith. And they finally came under the judgment of God. There was a believing few, as it were, and a great multitude of unbelievers. That's Paul's basic point. He may be overstating that a little bit for the sake of the present emphasis, but nevertheless, that's the idea. Many of them, though they were visibly part of the community, came under God's judgment. Paul wants the Corinthians to take note. Do some soul searching. Because that's where you might be, These things, he says, happened, they occurred as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not become idolaters, he says, as some of them did. As it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. You're toying with idolatry, is his warning to the Corinthians. This food sacrificed to idols, sure enough, the food itself is fine. But your cavalier attitude toward it, this kind of arrogant indifference about the whole process by which it arrived in the meat market, makes me wonder if you are yourselves a little bit cavalier about the risks associated with the seduction of idolatry. Look at these Israelites in the Old Testament. He says, look at them there. This is at Mount Sinai, of course. They built a golden calf. Moses is up getting the 10 Commandments. Fire, dark clouds on the top of the mountain, and the people are down below doing what? Committing idolatry right in the very presence of God. How seductive is that? How enticing can idolatry be? And Paul's concerned about these Corinthians, that maybe they are underestimating the alluring quality And it's reflected in the attitudes they're having about this food in the market, as it were. He'll say more about that as we go, but that seems to be where he's going. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did. And 23,000 fell in a single day. Again, you Corinthians, you have this casual attitude towards sexual immorality. We've talked about it before. Makes me wonder, because you look back at the Israelites in the Old Testament, and they themselves also tended to be a little bit less than scrupulous at the second point of sexual ethics. This is the Numbers 24 incident where the Moabite women insinuated themselves into the Israelite community, and many of the men of Israel were drawn in by that and finally came under God's judgment because of it. The warning here is simply that we always need to be on our guard. Anytime we get a little bit too cocky, a little too overconfident, a little too sure of ourselves, watch out. That's really his point here. We must not put God to the test as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. Don't complain as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. They were complainers back there in the wilderness. Remember that? And you Corinthians seem to be a little bit inclined that way. You're complaining against each other. You're complaining against me. Nothing's quite right. You don't like the color of the carpet. You don't like the stained glass windows. You don't like the music. You don't like this. You don't like that. And all of this kind of complaining attitude, again, makes me wonder whether some of you are going to be disqualified. It's a very severe warning, one that we should all take to heart, because it says the true evidence of the gospel in a person's life will be genuine humility. And these Old Testament examples are supposed to stand out as great, proofs that we could be in the Christian community, in a sense, but not of it. Just as we sometimes hear that put with reference to being in the world, but not of it. Verse 10. Verse 11. These things, Paul says, happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. I might just note in passing, these allusions to the Old Testament are a good reminder for us that we should be students of the Old Testament. We live at a time in Christian history when there's a woeful neglect of the Old Testament. It's a wonderful classroom for Christian instruction, And when we just kind of ignore it as if it weren't part of our Bible, we do so to our great poverty. Paul is referring here to wonderful Old Testament illustrations of things that we should all be thinking of. So read your Old Testament. It's filled with wonderful lessons that we can all take heart in. When he says the ends of the ages here, I think he means the ends of the age in which he's living. This is not the end of history. I don't think Paul viewed himself as living necessarily at the very end of human history, but it was certainly the end of a great age. The dawning of a new age. And we've talked about that theme before, and it seems to be alluded to here. So he says, verse 12, if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. On the other hand, don't be overly terrified. There's a wonderful balance here. Guarding against overconfidence, but guarding against over anxiety. So verse 13, this very well-known verse, no testing has overtaken you, but that is common to everyone. God is faithful. He will not let you be tested beyond your strength, but will with the testing provide the way out so that you'll be able to endure it. Notice how these two verses balance each other. On the one hand, he says, don't, if you think you're standing, watch out. Pride goes before destruction. A haughty spirit before a fall. When you start getting too cocky, confident, that sin would never be a problem for me. I'm really over that, Anytime we start getting too inflated with our own competence, that's a great risk. On the other hand, we should not be so fearful that we sort of give up. I can never do it. I'm never going to make it. I'm a complete failure, kind of thing. No, there's no place for that as well. There's a balance there. God will give you grace. We should be properly humble in the sense that we know that we depend day by day, moment by moment on God's grace. That gracious dependence should never breed arrogance, but it should give us great confidence lest we lapse into needless fear and Christian neurosis. That's no place for that either. Just this wonderful balance there. And that's what he wants them to find. He wants these Corinthians to discover that, hopefully, as they think about these lessons from the Old Testament. So now Paul begins to reach sort of the practical application of this. And it's a very interesting one, the rest of the chapter. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols. It's very interesting treatment here. Flee the worship of idols. Now, I realize we live in, 21st century America, and we think, well, that's not really a big problem. Don't you believe it? Just go home, flip on your TV, watch 3 commercials. And that should prove to you we live in an idolatrous culture, So we need to be on our guard. We have idolatry all around us. It just may be taking different shapes and sizes. We're always being seduced into putting something ahead of God. And that's all it takes to constitute an idol, as you're well aware. So flee idolatry, he says. I'm speaking to you as sensible people. The word sensible here, the root of the word means to do with sentient people. That is, people for whom taste and touch are, very much a part of our human experience, and you'll see why he puts it that way as we go along. He says, I'm writing to you as sentient people for whom taste and touch are significant. So think about this. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a sharing in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a sharing in the body of Christ? Now, Paul is anticipating a discussion he's going to take up later, the sacraments. Here it's just by way of illustration. Isn't it true that when we partake in the sacrament, we eat, we drink? This business of eating and drinking is a rather intimate thing, and in the sacramental moment, it somehow unites us uniquely with Christ. There's a reason that God has given us sacraments. He wants us to taste and touch that the Lord is good. He wants us to have this experience because He knows we are human. He knows we are sentient. And Paul is saying, now think about how deep that is. Think about how profound is that experience of eating and drinking in the setting of worship. He adds to that thought the following, verse 17, because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake in one body. In other words, not only are we united to Christ in the sacramental observance, but there's a sense in which we're united to each other. When we all together eat the bread, drink the wine, in a sense, our sense of being a family is increased. That's true. If somebody invites you over for dinner, and you all sit around a common table and have fellowship, eating together, there's a kind of intimacy that comes from eating together that is not the same as just having a chat on the street corner. There's something about that that's deeply unitive in our human experience, and God has made us that way, and that's why we have sacraments, But what Paul is saying here is think about how profound that is, and then ask yourself, what might be happening when you eat this food that you happen to know was associated with an idolatrous practice? Not that there's any problem with the food itself, but is there something in your mind? It's that kind of inquiry he wants us to do. He says, verse 18, consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? Even in Israel's worship, there was that same idea, that there was a kind of intimacy in the altar when they would eat the sacrificial animals and so on. Paul says now, he knows he's kind of leading them through an interesting little circuitous route, and he says, verse 19, now what am I implying by this? Am I implying that food sacrificed to idols is anything? Or that the idol is anything? Am I actually suggesting that there is a great goddess, Athena? Or that there is a Dionysius? Or that there is a Mars or a Hermes or a Zeus? Am I implying that those are real? No, Paul says. The pantheon of Greek gods is just the creative, fertile imagination of human beings. That's all. But Paul won't leave it there. He says, I'm not implying that, but, and this is even scarier then, verse 20, he says, I do imply that what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I don't want you to be partakers with demons. You see, Paul has really a more dreadful view of the Greco-Roman pantheon of deities, he would say that idolatrous religion generally is inspired, is fueled by hell itself, you see. Those pagan temples are not expressly in celebration of Satan or hell or demons, but he says that's the inspiration behind them. Paul has a deeply diabolical interpretation of what pagan religion is all about. It's the deception, you see, of hellish forces. And so Paul's concern here is that the cavalier attitude toward meat that's been offered in the pagan setting, this arrogant self-confidence, could actually be a kind of misguided self-confidence toward the powers of hell itself. And to start eating this food with that kind of overconfidence, Paul is concerned about that. You see how deep he goes into this point. He doesn't want to just leave it at a sort of superficial level. He says you can't have it both ways. Verse 21, you can't eat. You can't drink the cup of the Lord in the cup of demons. You can't partake of the cup of the Lord in the cup of daimonia, the Greek word there, demons. You can't serve two masters. There has to be a pure-hearted, conscientious devotion to Christ. And that in itself must dictate then how much and how far you're able to move, you see, in the culture without impinging on your conscience. Are you, he says, by your cavalier attitude, provoking God to jealousy? God is a jealous God. He doesn't want any part of your affections stolen by some other, even subtle kind of worship. Do you think that you're stronger than he is when you stand before him in judgment? So there's a very penetrating analysis Paul is bringing to this question. You know, it's a place for soul searching, because we have to ask this not so much with, food we buy in the marketplace or anything like that, but every one of us in this room has some point where we need to make that inquiry. Am I making a little deal with the devil here, subtly, in something that I'm allowing in my life? Is there something going on that has a much more ugly face behind it, and I'm just not wanting to see that? So, where does Paul come out? Well, very practical, and I think very sensible at verse 23. He says, so bottom line, all things are indeed lawful, but not all things are beneficial. The food is fine. Eating is fine. But be on your guard. He says, all things are lawful, but not all things build up. Be on my guard not only for myself, but for my neighbor. You see. Think about myself, think about you. You think about me. We're working together toward a common good end. Don't, verse 24, seek your own advantage, but that of the other. So, what do? Verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Why? Because the earth is the Lord's in the fullness. Walk into the Albertsons and with gusto say, I'll have 5 pounds of that hamburger on the spot, Don't worry about food, don't worry about where it came from. If your conscience is clear on this, then buy it, throw it on the barbecue, and enjoy it. That's what Paul says. Furthermore, he says, verse 27, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal, and you're disposed to go, whatever is set before you, eat it without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Somebody invites you out, feel free. Whatever's put before you, eat it, enjoy it. It's not what goes in the mouth that defiles, it's what comes out. There's a great kind of robust, wide open, joyful, thankful appreciation and grateful acceptance of God's good gifts to us. But, verse 28, if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then Paul says, don't eat it. Out of consideration for the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I mean, he says, the other's conscience, not your own. So if you, with robust conscience, can eat this food without any hesitation, fine. But if you become aware that there's somebody watching you, and they actually are concerned enough that they voice the concern. Didn't you know that was offered in sacrifice? Then all of a sudden you pull back and say, because you're concerned about that person. Not because you think the food is demon-possessed, but because you don't want to do anything to trip them up And at the same time, you're searching your own soul to make sure you're not doing anything to trip yourself up. Very practical. And this is really a good test. I mean, this is really the way, the kind of razor edge that we bring to these ethical issues in life as we go through them, where there may be difference of opinion among Christian believers. So he goes on, why should my liberty be subject to the judgment of someone else's conscience? That which I can accept as, in full liberty and full, why should that come under judgment from somebody else? Why should I put myself in that position? If I can partake with thankfulness, why should I be denounced because of that for which I give thanks? The implication being that if I'm accepting this with thankfulness, then I can forego it with thankfulness. I shouldn't put myself in a position of being subjected to someone else's negative scrutiny in a way that might injure them and injure our harmony of faith. So whatever you eat and drink, whatever you do everything for the glory of God. Don't offend anybody. Not the Jews, not the Greeks, not the church. Just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, seeking not my own advantage, but that of the larger community, so that they may be saved and be imitators of me as I am of Christ. A remarkable discussion, this 3 chapters on eating food sacrificed to idols. And that brings us now to this very interesting concluding discussion about wearing hats in church. So here we go. What was going on? Again, this seems to be a question the Corinthians had raised to Paul. And let me give you what at least appears to be the background for this. Again, it's a Jewish versus Gentile kind of cultural issue that's going on. In the Jewish community, it was common for both men and women to wear head coverings, especially in worship. The men would wear the head covering as a symbolic statement of humility. That was the message. That was the meaning. And to this day, that's part of Jewish observance. So men wear a covering for that purpose. Women would wear a covering as a sign of their submission within the family unit, recognizing either the husband or the father as that person responsible for the family. You see, so the head covering had 2 slightly different significances depending on whose head was being covered. On the Gentile side, men tended not to wear head coverings for symbolic purposes. They might wear them to, protect their head from the sun, but for a kind of symbolic purpose, men didn't wear head coverings, but women did in public. But when a Greek woman got home, she'd take off her head covering. Now the question was, when women wound up in the home where the church was meeting, because remember these are home churches, there's no church building in Corinth at this point. So the question was, a woman winds up in a church building that is a home, and she's with the family, then does she take her hat off, would be the Greek custom, which apparently they were doing, or does she leave it on, which was the Jewish custom, which was what the Jewish women were doing, and then they were looking at each other in church and going, how come you got your hat on? And they were going, how come you took your hat off? You got this kind of... And so again, they find things to fight about. It's wonderful Corinthians, whatever they can figure out to have a shooting match on, they do. And that seems to be then the basis for this. And Paul seems to allude to them raising that question then in the first part of chapter 11. I'm going to have to just zip through this, but let's see what we can do. I commend you, he says, because you remember me in everything and remember the traditions just as I handed them. He probably is alluding to their own letter to him in which they say, we are continuing to observe your traditions. But this seems to have been an unanswered question with respect to those traditions. So he says this, but I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, the husband is the head of the wife, God is the head of Christ. Now this is a very interesting kind of description of the authority that God has put in the universe, which begins in the Trinity. There's no difference in dignity between the Father and the Son, but the Son has voluntarily submitted himself to the Father. And there's a kind of reflection of that in the human family. There's no intrinsic difference of dignity between a man and a woman, but God has placed the Father, as it were, in that position of great responsibility, and at the same time placed the wife in the position of respecting that, you see, and supporting that. So that seems to be the basic concept Paul's working from. That principle, of course, is not abrogated in the New Testament. There's a huge elevation of the status of women in the New Testament, as we've said many times, but a kind of order in the family, a division of labor, in which, as it were, the buck stops. with the father/husband is protected and seems to be preserved in the biblical approach. But the woman's status is greatly elevated, and she's not in any way demeaned in the New Testament description. So Paul is reminding us of this. Now, kind of referring to the cultural norm, any man who prays or prophesies having something on his head disgraces his head. That was the Jewish practice. It was a humiliating thing. Paul's concern is that doesn't properly reflect, I'm going to say it this way, the Trinitarian message that's supposed to be communicated by these human relationships. There should be no disgrace, as it were, on the husband's head, because in a sense he's reflecting now, in a human way, that status that the Father has in the Trinity. If you think about that, I think it'll make some sense. So he discourages that the man should not have something on his head because it sends the wrong message. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head, because that would be then a mark of rebellion. And just as in the Trinity, the Son submits to the Father, there's a voluntary submission that the Son gives to the Father, so there should be a similar kind of submission of the family to the Father's authority and responsibility there. And so Paul says, if she refuses that mark of submission, then it's altogether as if the same thing as if her head were shaved. In that culture, a shaved head meant one of two things. Either the woman was a prostitute, the highest form of rebellion, or she was an adulteress, which was an equally abhorrent form of rebellion. He's saying, it's sort of a black and white issue here. If she's going to refuse to take the mark of submission, then in a sense she's standing on the side of rebellion. She might as well, take the whole message. I mean, might adopt the whole message of that rebellion if she's going to refuse this sort of minor expression of it. That seems to be Paul's idea. Verse 6 then. For if the woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it's a disgrace for her to have her hair cut off, then she should wear the veil. You see, one way or the other. Now, let's just, station identification here. Does this mean that that the women should all be wearing veils? I look about the room. Most of you women are in trouble. You see, I don't see any veils on your heads. But I think you're aware that there are Christian traditions that actually take this very literally. And when you go into church, you put, if nothing else, a little doily on your head, something there that carries forth this. And I think those people are probably to be applauded, but I don't think they're not doing what's necessary within the teaching of this text. I'm giving you my opinion. My personal opinion is that the best people are on my position on this, but nevertheless, it's not distinctly my position. But it's a distinction I think we can bring to this text and others like it, where we have a working distinction between form and substance. In the First Corinthian setting, in the setting of Corinth, first century Corinth, the formal way of communicating the message of proper order in the family was head uncovered for the man, head covered for the woman. I don't know that in 21st century America, when I see a woman with a hat on, I immediately think, oh, she's submitting to her husband. In other words, the content is important, but the form is probably changed. It's important that the family order be preserved. That, I think, we can argue pretty substantively from the text of Scripture. But the way in which the message is sent may have changed from one culture to another. By the way, on this point of the man being the head of the family, again, I think it just needs to be pointed out that from a biblical point of view, probably the operative word there is not so much authority as responsibility. The New Testament lays a huge, huge responsibility on the husband/father in the family. If I could just put it briefly, he's responsible to provide for his family. He's responsible to protect his family. He's responsible to nurture his family. Those are huge duties. And the New Testament is quite clear that that man is going to stand before God and give a distinctive account for how he discharged those responsibilities with respect to his wife and his children. He's to love her as Christ loved the church. This is a huge duty that's laid on him. The family is asked in its turn to respect that great duty that's been laid on him. That's really the idea. There's no dictatorial tyranny that's authorized in the New Testament. And husbands that try to use texts like this as a battering ram to assert their so-called authority have abused it beyond any recognition. That's not what the New Testament is authorizing, but that there is a responsibility that lies sort of distinctively to the head of the house being the husband. I realize different families are configured differently, and this may not apply to every family, but in terms of the baso-family description as we find it conventionally in the New Testament, that seems to be a pretty intact principle. But how the message is communicated, whether it's a doily on your head or something else, I think that's negotiable, and it seems to me that the best commentators on this text have recognized that. Okay, let's pick up verse 7. For a man ought not to have his head veiled. Now this is the point. A man ought not to have his head veiled because he is the image and reflection of God, and it seems from what Paul said earlier in the text, he means God the Father. In other words, reflecting that Trinitarian family in an earthly symbol, the man is in the position, as it were, of the office there of God the Father. And thus, he shouldn't humiliate his head sending a wrong message. That's the idea. Now, it's not to say that the man is God. You understand that. This is all just to say we have human reflections of great divine truth in the human relationships that we maintain. But the woman is, of course, the reflection then of the man, just as Christ, in a sense, is the reflection of the Father. Christ is the glory of the Father. We read in the book of Hebrews chapter 1. In the same sense, the wife, in a sense, is the glory of her husband. And it's a reflection of this wonderful Trinitarian unity that we see in the human family. And so, part of how she communicates that is her submission, just as Christ communicates the glory of the Father by His submission to the Father. I don't do my own will, Jesus says, but the will of the one who sent me. It's part of the theme of His whole ministry. Neither was, then Paul continues, alluding to Genesis, neither was the man created for the sake of the woman. Man was created first, as you're well aware, from the Genesis account. Woman was created as a great helpmeet for him, and that wonderful kind of balance that's pictured there. But Paul corrects it now, because of the angels. Let's take verse 10. Can I do this? Oh, dear. Okay. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. That one. You ever wondered about that? Because of the angels. This is, we'll just do the best we can. There's 1,000 views of this, the because of the angels. What is that about? Because of the angels. And I'm going to tell you, I've read a bunch of opinions. I'm going to give you what I think is going on. I'm not very dogmatic on this, sort of unusual for me, but this I think is at least the most sane view of it. And I think it's a healthy view. It seems that Paul's view of corporate worship in the church is that we are never any closer to heaven than when we are together in the community of faith worshiping God. Where two or three are gathered, there I am in your midst. There's no point where heaven comes closer to earth or earth gets closer to heaven than that moment when we gather together to sing and pray as the community of faith, visibly expressing our devotion to Christ. It's a high and holy thing we are doing when we engage in corporate worship. We take that very seriously, I think you're aware. And there is an idea that you find hints of biblically that in a sense we are joined by the population of heaven at the time of our worship. We don't see them, but if you can imagine angels sitting up there, I can see them now. There they are. Thousands of them, you see, and they're looking in on us and observing and rejoicing in our worship. We don't want to offend them. I don't know if that's what Paul means, but I like the idea, so there you go. That's where we're going to leave that. And I've seen some pretty good arguments in favor of that, but from this text and a few others. Nevertheless, Paul says, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man independent of woman. Notice how Paul corrects now an overstatement. Even though he's put the husband in the highest responsibility in the family, he immediately makes it clear his dependence on her and hers on him. Just as the woman came from the man, so the man comes through the woman. We can't overstate this patriarchalism in a way that distorts the fundamental principle here. But all things come from God. Paul makes an allusion in the last few verses to the common practice that has tended to be the case in history of men wearing their hair short, women wearing their hair long. I think it's kind of a throwaway argument, frankly. I don't think Paul is hanging his whole case on that. It's more or less a passing allusion to the fact that it's commonly the case, isn't it? You know, in virtually any culture, you're going to find that there's almost an intuitive reflection of this principle he's giving us in that practice. Time is up, so I won't say more about it. In the final analysis, he says, verse 16, if anyone is disposed to be contentious, then at least recognize this, that this is the custom in the churches, and such a person's contention, on this point is out of order. Now there you are. That's not a fun text. So listen, this is the end of the line for us through the year, and I just want to take a brief opportunity to thank you from the bottom of my heart that you come here every week. It just means a lot to me. I'm very sincere about that. I think about you all week long because I prepare these lessons all week long, and I think about individual faces of many of you there, and so it just is a great honor to be able to have this ministry among you. And that will conclude our discussions of 1 Corinthians, at least for now. But as you know, we'll be coming back in the fall and picking up right at this very point sometime, I believe, in September. So, yes.
I just want to say, you thanked us for coming here, but we want to thank you for teaching
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.